Why COVID-19 parties are like English S&M.
What you say?
Why COVID-19 parties are like English S&M. You guys might have come across the ABC News story saying that college students in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, were throwing bacchanalian college parties with a twist. People pay to get in. The money goes into a pot. First person to catch COVID pockets the cash.
What you say?
You got it. Mums do measles parties for the kids. Students do COVID parties for the cash. The story was picked up by such heavyweights of investigative reporting as CNN, NBC's Today Show, the Associated Press, the New York Post, Insider, The Hill, and others. So it must be true, right? Well, first point is that there are serious doubts about whether or not this is a whole load of... The story was sparked by the following comments made by two city officials. They put money in a pot and they try to get COVID, said Sonia McKinstry, a Tuscaloosa city councillor. Whoever gets COVID first gets the pot. It makes no sense. They're intentionally doing it. Well, no participants in these alleged raves have ever been identified or interviewed. Then there's the fact that Alabama newspaper reporter Brian Lyman tweeted that the sourcing for this story was uncertain. Read practically non-existent. Thirdly, the University of Alabama told the Today Show that it hadn't been able to identify any students who had taken part in COVID-19 parties. I could go on, but you get the point. John Christian has already commented on the way in which this kind of story feeds into the narrative that the pandemic's continued spread is due to the irresponsible young rather than impotent leadership stemming from an irresponsible and arrogant POTUS. Well, there's also the argument that it could even encourage the kind of behaviour it condemns. But I'd like to consider another angle. Working on the assumption that such a party existed, who's to say it shouldn't be allowed? Okay, I get it. Some of you will be thinking, how could you say such a thing, with the infection rate ringing alarm bells all over the country and the death toll mounting like a war zone? Others will be thinking, is this some right-wing libertarian laissez-faire shtick in praise of so-called liberty at the expense of social cohesion? Hear me out. Clearly this is part of a much broader question about rights and responsibilities, and I'm not claiming to be a moral philosopher. But that said, all of us have to think about the extent to which it's right for the state to get involved in private behaviour. Why it should, why it shouldn't, when it should act, and when it should back up. And that's why I say, to get a grip on what's going on here, it's useful to compare COVID-19 parties with S&M, particularly with the House of Lords decision in the 1993 case of the Crown against Brown and others. Now, I'm not going into the gory details. Safe to say you need a strong stomach to be exposed to what these guys were doing to each other. But the case involved, in summary, a group of middle-aged men involved in consensual sadomasochistic activities with younger guys. Obviously, the emphasis is on consensual here. No one complained. The police, however, got wind of these parties and promptly charged the parties with actual bodily harm and grievous bodily harm. Now, I don't know what the American equivalents are, but these are high-end assaults. Mr. Brown and others were tried and found guilty. They appealed their convictions on the basis that the Crown had to prove A, that there was no consent, and B, that they had been wrongly charged. The argument was that they should have been charged with indecency offences rather than assaults. Conveniently, the indecency offences were time-barred. Well, this one went to the wire. Eventually, the Crown won on a split decision. The majority reasoning given in the decision of Lord Templeman went a little something like this. 1. The authorities dealing with the intentional infliction of bodily harm did not establish that consent was a defence to a charge under the Offences Against a Person Act. They established that the courts had accepted that consent was a defence in the course of some lawful activities. Catch the difference?
Can you dig it?
Whether the defence should be extended to the infliction of bodily harm in the course of sadomasochistic encounters could only be decided by consideration of policy and public interest. Thirdly, the appellant's practices were unpredictably dangerous and degrading to body and mind. Fourthly, they were developed with increasing barbarity and taught to persons whose consents were dubious or worthless. Fifthly, there were obvious dangers of serious personal injury and blood infection. 6. There was a difference between violence which was incidental and violence which was inflicted for the indulgence of cruelty. 7th, the violence of sadists and the degradations of their victims had sexual motivations, but sex was no excuse for violence. 8. And lastly, society was entitled and bound to protect itself against the cult of violence. Pleasure derived from the infliction of pain was an evil thing. Cruelty was uncivilized. The dissenting judgments basically argued, 1. In the case of Lord Slynn, this was something the legislature, not judges, should sort out. And secondly, in the case of Lord Mustill, laissez-faire, the state should butt out. What's all this got to do with the COVID party? Well look, if some enthusiastic prosecutor was to charge an unsuspecting party-goer with the intentional infliction of COVID-19, and over here in the UK, this would be grievous bodily harm, it is after all potentially fatal, would the party-goer have a defence? Looking at Lord Templeman's judgment, and obviously I'm dealing with English jurisprudence, it's clear that the mere fact that the party-goers consented to being infected is not the end of the story. It's not even the beginning of the end. Any health insurance policies are likely to be invalidated by the consensual contraction of disease, which would mean that any care of the infected would be paid for out of the public purse. This means that policy considerations are likely to be party poopers. If sex isn't an excuse for violence, it might be difficult to argue that the hope of winning some cash is. But that still leaves us with the problem of sport, for example boxing or MMA. Doesn't that involve consenting to the infliction of violence for the sake of cash? In order to get around this, most jurisdictions resort to a legal fiction that goes a little something like this. If the intention of the activity is the infliction of harm, it is illegal. However, if harm is a foreseen potential consequence of the activity, if the parties consent, it may not be illegal. So long as people consent to play by the rules, they may be able to give valid consent to any harm they suffer. That said, it might have been interesting trying to explain that to Evander Holyfield the night Mike Tyson chewed part of his ear off.
There he bites him there, you see him lift his teeth.
Is the consent of our party-goers dubious or worthless, using Lord Templeman's phrases? Clearly not. But does that fact outweigh the considerations we've just looked at? Probably not. Would it be right to wait for the state to legislate? Probably not. Should the state butt out? Probably not. In short, the immortal phrase attributed to Patrick Henry back in 1775, "Give me liberty or give me death," is a catchy headline, but a poor guide to public policy. And as for all the hoopla around COVID-19 parties, definitely a bum deal for all concerned.